Life has a peculiar way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them. In the bustling downtown precinct of a major metropolitan city, where glass towers stretch toward the clouds and streets pulse with the rhythm of countless lives intersecting, a story unfolded that would challenge perceptions and remind us all about the danger of assumptions. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in September when Officer Michael Thompson started his patrol shift. With 15 years on the force, he developed what he believed to be an infallible instinct about people. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of coffee from nearby cafes as he watched a young black man in an impeccably tailored suit approach one of the city's most prestigious office buildings. Something about the man's presence there didn't sit right with Thompson. The officer had patrolled this affluent business district for years, and while he would never admit it out loud, he had certain expectations about who belonged and who didn't. The young man's suit might have been expensive, but Thompson's prejudices ran deeper than any surface-level observation could penetrate. Making a snap judgment, Thompson decided to approach the man. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, his tone carrying that subtle edge of authority that had become second nature. "This is a private building. Mind telling me where you're headed?" The question itself seemed innocent enough, but the underlying message was clear: you don't look like you belong here. The young man stopped, his shoulders tensing slightly before he turned around. Despite the obvious disrespect in the officer's tone, he maintained his composure, years of similar encounters having taught him the delicate dance of navigating such situations. "I work here," he replied simply, his voice steady and professional. Officer Thompson's skepticism was evident in his smirk. "Right. And I'm the mayor," he scoffed, taking a step closer. "Let's see some ID." The morning crowd began to slow their pace, some stopping to witness the interaction, phones discreetly emerging from pockets and purses. The young man reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate and calm, though his eyes reflected a mixture of frustration and resignation. As he pulled out his identification, a golden badge clipped to his belt caught the morning sun. Thompson's eyes narrowed, focusing on what appeared to be an executive security clearance badge, the highest level of access in the building. But that couldn't be right. There must be some mistake. The young man handed over his ID, along with a business card. "I'm actually starting my first day as the new Chief Operations Officer," he explained, maintaining his dignity despite the humiliation of having to justify his presence. "I was hired last month after serving as Regional Director at our West Coast office." The color drained from Officer Thompson's face as he read the credentials. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This man wasn't just an employee, he was now one of the highest-ranking executives in the entire corporation. More importantly, due to the company's recent contract with the city for their security services, this meant that technically, the young man he had just profiled would be overseeing all police contracts in the district. The morning crowd had grown, their whispers creating a soft backdrop to the tense scene. Officer Thompson stood frozen, his earlier confidence evaporating as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. He had allowed his prejudices to guide his actions, and now those same actions would have consequences he couldn't have imagined. The young executive extended his hand, a gesture that spoke volumes about his character. "I believe we'll be seeing a lot of each other, Officer Thompson," he said, his voice carrying no hint of revenge or malice, just simple statement of fact. "Perhaps we can start fresh and work together to make some positive changes in this community." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning and possibility. As the morning sun continued to rise over the city skyline, casting long shadows across the gathering crowd, both men stood at a crossroads. One humbled by his prejudices, the other rising above them. What would happen next would not only shape their professional relationship, but had the potential to transform an entire community's approach to law enforcement and racial bias. In that moment, as both men stood facing each other, time seemed to slow down. The morning bustle of the city faded into the background as Officer Thompson struggled to find the right words. His hand, still holding the executive's credentials, trembled slightly, a detail not lost on the growing crowd of onlookers. The new COO, James Richardson, had seen that look before. The mix of shame, fear, and defensive anger that often came when someone's prejudices were suddenly and publicly confronted. But unlike many others who had faced similar discrimination, Richardson had spent years preparing for moments like these. His response would not be born from anger, but from a deeper understanding of how change really happens. "Officer," Richardson spoke, his voice carrying across the now quiet sidewalk, "would you mind walking with me to my office? I believe we have some important matters to discuss." The invitation was both a professional courtesy and a subtle power move, allowing Thompson to save face while making it clear who was now in charge. As they walked through the building's impressive lobby, Thompson's mind raced back to his own journey. He joined the force right after high school, following in his father's footsteps. The old man had been a cop in a different era, one where certain attitudes were not just accepted but expected. Thompson had inherited more than just his father's badge. He'd inherited a worldview that he'd never truly questioned until now. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent, heavy with unspoken words. Richardson stood calmly, checking emails on his phone, while Thompson shifted uncomfortably, hyper-aware of his reflection in the polished elevator doors. His uniform, usually a source of pride, felt like a costume he no longer deserved to wear. Richardson's new office was exactly what you'd expect for a COO corner suite, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city below. As they entered, Richardson gestured for Thompson to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Coffee?" he offered, catching Thompson off guard with the casual hospitality. Yes, thank you," Thompson managed, his training in handling difficult situations proving useless in this unexpected scenario. He watched as Richardson pressed a button on his desk phone, requesting 2 coffees from his assistant. "You know," Richardson began, settling into his chair, 10 years ago, I was standing outside a different building, in a different city, facing a very similar situation." He paused as the assistant brought in their coffee. "The officer who stopped me that day changed my life, though not in the way you might think." Thompson's hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup, grateful for something to focus on. "What happened?" he found himself asking, genuine curiosity breaking through his defensive shell. "That officer, like you, made assumptions about me based on how I looked. But unlike today, I was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, fresh out of business school, heading to my first major job interview." Richardson's eyes grew distant with the memory. "He detained me for nearly an hour, convinced I was casing the building for a robbery. By the time he finally let me go, I'd missed my interview." Thompson winced, but Richardson continued with a slight smile. "That company called me later, apologizing for the misunderstanding. Apparently someone had witnessed the whole thing. They rescheduled my interview, and I got the job. But more importantly, that incident showed me something crucial about systemic change." Outside the office windows, clouds cast moving shadows across the city landscape. A gentle rain began to fall, drops racing down the glass like tears. Richardson stood and walked to the window, his reflection overlaying the cityscape beyond. "You see, Officer Thompson, that incident could have made me bitter. It could have reinforced every negative stereotype about law enforcement. Instead, it motivated me to climb as high as I could, not just for personal success, but to be in a position to effect real change." Thompson felt the weight of every wrong assumption, every biased decision he'd made over his career pressing down on him. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richardson turned back from the window, his expression thoughtful. "Because in about 30 minutes, I have my first meeting with the city's Police Oversight Committee. As the new COO, I'll be reviewing and approving all security contracts between this company and the police department. And I believe everything happens for a reason." The implications hung heavy in the air. Thompson's career, his future, rested in the hands of the man he just publicly humiliated. But Richardson wasn't finished. "I'm going to make you an offer, Officer Thompson. One that might seem like punishment at first, but I assure you, it's an opportunity. The story of what happened next would soon spread through the department like wildfire, but not for the reasons anyone might have expected. Richardson's proposition would challenge not just Officer Thompson, but the entire precinct's approach to community policing. It would become a testament to the power of transformation, and how sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth. As the rain continued to fall outside, both men sat in that office, unaware that their conversation would spark a chain of events that would reshape not just their lives, but the lives of countless others in their community. The real question wasn't whether change was possible, but whether both men were ready for the journey ahead. Richardson's proposal was both simple and revolutionary. Officer Thompson would become the lead liaison between the police department and the company's new community outreach program. But there was a catch: he would need to spend 3 months working directly with inner-city youth, organizing workshops that brought together police officers and local teenagers for honest conversations about their experiences. Initially, Thompson balked at the idea. He'd spent 15 years building his reputation as a tough, no-nonsense officer. The thought of facilitating what he dismissed as feel-good talking sessions seemed like a deliberate humiliation. But as Richardson laid out the full scope of the program, something in Thompson's perspective began to shift. "This isn't about punishment," Richardson explained, pulling up a presentation on his computer. "It's about breaking down walls that shouldn't exist in the first place. Every week, I see talented young people walk through these doors, questioning whether they belong here. Not because they lack ability, but because people like us have made them feel unwelcome." The weeks that followed tested Thompson in ways he never expected. His first workshop was a disaster. The teenagers were hostile, the other officers skeptical, and Thompson himself felt completely out of his depth. He returned home that night ready to quit, the voices of angry young people ringing in his ears. But something kept him going back. Maybe it was pride, or perhaps the way Richardson would stop by each session, not to supervise, but to participate. The COO shared stories of his own struggles, his failures, and his successes, encouraging others to do the same. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere in the workshops began to change. 6 weeks into the program, during a particularly heated discussion about police profiling, a young participant named Chris shared a story that hit Thompson like a physical blow. The teenager described being stopped and questioned while walking to his grandmother's house, wearing his school debate team jacket. The officer had assumed the jacket was stolen. "The worst part wasn't the accusation," Chris said, his voice steady but his hands trembling. "It was the look in my grandmother's eyes when she came out and saw me against the police car. Like she was watching something break inside me that she couldn't fix." Thompson found himself thinking about his own son, about the world he was helping to create. That night, he stayed late at the community center, rewriting the entire curriculum for the remaining workshops. When Richardson arrived the next morning, he found Thompson asleep at his desk, surrounded by papers covered in notes and ideas. The program began to attract attention. Other precincts requested information, and local news stations started showing up to cover the workshops. But with the spotlight came scrutiny. Some of Thompson's old colleagues accused him of going soft, while others questioned Richardson's motives, suggesting this was all just a corporate PR stunt. The tension reached its peak during the final week of the initial 3-month program. Thompson had organized a special session that would bring together high-ranking police officials, corporate leaders, and community members. The goal was to present the program's results and propose its expansion across the city. The morning of the presentation, Thompson arrived early to find the community center's walls covered in hateful graffiti. Someone had broken in overnight, leaving messages that made it clear not everyone wanted to see the program succeed. As participants began arriving, the atmosphere grew tense. Years of mistrust and anger threatened to boil over. Richardson stood in the doorway, watching as Thompson faced the crowd. The officer who had once stopped him based on prejudice was about to either bridge a crucial gap or watch everything they'd built crumble. The room fell silent as Thompson stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment visible in his expression. What happened next would become legendary in the department, a story passed down through years of training sessions. But more importantly, it would mark a turning point in how one community began to heal decades-old wounds. As Thompson stood at the podium, his carefully prepared speech felt inadequate in the face of the vandalized walls surrounding them. The silence in the room was deafening, thick with anticipation and unspoken tension. But before he could speak, the community center's doors burst open, and in walked someone who changed everything: Officer David Thompson Jr., his son. The younger Thompson, fresh from the police academy, stood in his crisp new uniform, eyes moving from the hateful graffiti to his father's face. No one had expected him to be there. He was supposed to be starting his first day of patrol across town. His presence sent whispers rippling through the crowd. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I requested a transfer to this precinct." He paused, swallowing hard. "I wanted to be part of what you're building here." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Thompson Sr. gripped the podium tighter, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Richardson watched from the back of the room as father and son locked eyes across the space. He knew this moment wasn't in the program, but sometimes the most powerful changes come from unexpected places. The young officer's arrival had transformed what could have been just another presentation into something far more personal and profound. But the morning held one more surprise. As Thompson Jr. made his way to the front, Chris, the teenager who had shared his story about being profiled, stood up. "Officer Thompson," he called out, addressing the younger man, "before you join this program, I think you should hear what your father said to me last week." The room held its breath. Chris walked to the front, pulling out his phone. He had recorded their conversation, something that would have once made Thompson Sr. defensive and angry. But now, as his son watched, he felt only pride in what was about to be shared. The recording played, filling the room with Thompson Sr.'s voice. "I stopped a young man once, just like you were stopped. I made assumptions that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with fear I didn't even know I carried. That young man became my boss, and instead of revenge, he offered me a chance to change. But changing isn't enough. We have to be willing to admit our mistakes to the next generation, so they don't repeat them." Thompson Jr.'s eyes welled with tears as he listened to his father's confession. The room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, not tense, but transformative. The hateful graffiti on the walls seemed to fade into insignificance against the power of this moment. Richardson stepped forward, taking his place beside both Thompsons. "This program was never about just changing policies," he began, his voice steady and clear. "It was about changing hearts, one story at a time. But what we didn't expect was how those stories would ripple out, touching lives we never anticipated." Just then, someone from the back of the room stood up, one of the senior police officials who had been most skeptical of the program. "I think," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "we need to talk about what happened in my precinct 30 years ago." The room shifted its attention, sensing another layer of truth about to be revealed. As the official began to speak, Thompson Sr. looked at his son, then at Richardson, understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't just about making amends or implementing new policies anymore. They were witnessing the beginning of a generational shift, a moment when the walls between us and them began to crumble. But even as hope filled the room, a new challenge was emerging. Outside, news vans were arriving, drawn by reports of the vandalism. How they handled the next few minutes would determine whether this became just another sensational headline about police and community conflict, or something far more meaningful. As the news vans gathered outside, Richardson, both Thompsons, and Chris huddled together near the podium. The senior police official, Chief William Hayes, was still speaking, revealing a painful story from his early days on the force that had haunted him for 3 decades. His voice carried the weight of years of unspoken regret. "I was that officer," Hayes admitted, his weathered face showing every year of his service. "The one who thought he was protecting the community by making assumptions. The one who taught a whole generation of officers to do the same." He turned to face Thompson Sr., including your father, Mike. I was his training officer. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Thompson Sr. felt his world shift again as pieces of his past suddenly clicked into place. He remembered his father's changes after working with Hayes, how the casual prejudices at home had grown stronger, more deliberate. A legacy of bias passed down like a family heirloom. Richardson stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. The media outside is expecting a story about division, he said, looking around the room. They're waiting for us to emerge angry, pointing fingers, feeding into the narrative that nothing ever changes. But I think we have the chance to show them something different. That's when Thompson Jr. spoke up, his voice strong despite his youth. The graffiti on these walls, he said, it's not just hate. It's fear. The same fear that made my father stop you, Mr. Richardson. The same fear that made Chief Hayes train officers to profile. The same fear that made me almost choose a different precinct than my father's. Chris pulled out his phone again, but this time he wasn't playing a recording. He had been messaging his friends, and they were responding. The doors opened, and teenagers began streaming in dozens of them, carrying paint rollers, brushes, and buckets of paint. They were followed by their parents, their grandparents, and then, surprisingly, more police officers. We can cover up the hate, Chris announced, but first, I think we need to photograph it. Document it. Not to spread more anger, but to remember where we started. Then we'll paint over it together every color, every generation, every uniform, and every civilian. The news cameras were rolling as the doors opened, capturing the moment when barriers began to break down. Officers and teenagers working side by side, parents and children sharing brushes, stories flowing as freely as the paint. But the real story wasn't in the physical transformation of the walls. As they worked, Chief Hayes approached Thompson Sr. with tears in his eyes. Your father, he said softly, he tried to change, at the end. He left a letter. I've carried it for years, never knowing how to give it to you. From his uniform pocket, he pulled out an aged envelope, its edges worn soft with time. With trembling hands, Thompson Sr. opened the letter, his son and Richardson standing beside him. The words inside would remain private, but their impact was visible on his face: grief, understanding, and finally peace. His father had begun the journey they were now completing, but hadn't lived long enough to finish it. Richardson watched as 3 generations of law enforcement, Hayes, Thompson Sr. and Thompson Jr., embraced, their uniforms marked with paint, their barriers finally broken. He thought about that morning months ago when Thompson Sr. had stopped him outside the building. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of discomfort. The community center's walls were transformed that day, but they weren't just covered in fresh paint. They were covered in promises to listen, to learn, to change, and most importantly, to remain uncomfortable enough to keep growing. As the news cameras captured the final touches, Chris stepped up to Thompson Sr. with one last surprise. We'd like you to be our first civilian instructor, he said, teaching new officers alongside their academy training. Not just about what not to do, but about how to be part of real change. He gestured to the newly painted walls. This isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. As the sun set on that transformative day, Richardson stood outside his office building, at the exact spot where Thompson had stopped him months ago. Tomorrow, the headlines would tell a story of reconciliation and hope. But the real story, the one that would continue to unfold in quiet conversations, in changed policies, and in transformed hearts, was just beginning. The security camera that had captured their first confrontation was still there, silently recording. But now it wasn't documenting division, it was witnessing the start of something new. Something that began with one officer's mistake and one executive's choice to respond with opportunity rather than revenge. Something that would ripple out to touch countless lives in ways they had yet to discover. 1 year later, the community center had become a model for police reform across the country. The walls that once bore hateful graffiti now displayed photographs documenting the journey from that tense morning outside the office building to the paint-splattered day of transformation. But more importantly, they displayed the stories of lives changed, one conversation at a time. Thompson Sr. had found his true calling as a civilian instructor. His classes became legendary among new recruits, not for their rigid protocols or tactical training, but for their raw honesty. He started each session by showing the security camera footage of his confrontation with Richardson, using his own mistake as a powerful teaching tool. The newest class of officers learned not just how to police, but how to truly serve their communities. Chris went on to create a youth mentorship program, pairing teenagers with officers for long-term relationships that went beyond the usual community outreach efforts. The program had a waiting list now, with both officers and young people eager to participate. He often joked that his grandmother's pride in his work had finally surpassed her worry when she saw him talking to police officers. Thompson Jr. rose quickly through the ranks, his approach to policing shaped by witnessing his father's transformation. He kept his father's letter in his uniform pocket, a reminder that change wasn't just possible, it was essential. His presence in the precinct served as a living bridge between the old guard and the new way of thinking. Chief Hayes retired that year, but not before implementing sweeping changes in training protocols across the department. His final act was to establish a civilian oversight committee, with Richardson serving as its first chairperson. The committee wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it had real power to shape policy and hold officers accountable. As for Richardson, he kept his office door open to anyone who wanted to share their stories or suggest improvements. The security guard who had witnessed that first confrontation now sat at a desk nearby, promoted to head of building security. They often shared knowing looks when new visitors arrived, remembering how one tense morning had sparked such profound change. On the anniversary of that transformative day at the community center, they all gathered again. The room was packed with faces both familiar and new: officers, community members, young people, and civic leaders. But this time, there was no tension in the air, no need for dramatic revelations or emotional breakthroughs. Instead, there was something far more powerful: hope made real through action. Richardson stood at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd. "A year ago," he began, "we stood in this room surrounded by hate. Today, we stand here surrounded by proof that change isn't just possible, it's inevitable when people choose to be brave enough to face their own biases and strong enough to forgive others who are learning to face theirs." As he spoke, Thompson Sr. sat between his son and Chris, their presence a living testament to the power of choosing understanding over anger, growth over stagnation. The letter from his father rested in his pocket, its wisdom now shared with a new generation. The hardest part isn't admitting you were wrong, it's doing the work to make it right. The story of the officer and the executive could have ended that morning outside the office building. It could have been just another viral video, another moment of conflict that reinforced existing divisions. Instead, it became a catalyst for real change, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful responses to prejudice aren't found in revenge or punishment, but in the courage to offer someone the chance to transform. As the evening wound down, Richardson and Thompson Sr. found themselves standing outside the building where their story began. The security camera still watched silently overhead, but now it witnessed something different: two men who had moved beyond their roles as officer and executive to become partners in creating lasting change. "You know," Thompson Sr. said, looking up at the building, "I never thanked you properly for not giving up on me that day." Richardson smiled, remembering the nervous officer who had approached him that morning. "Sometimes," he replied, "the best way to change the world is to help someone else change their mind." They shared a knowing look, understanding that their story wasn't really ending, it was still being written, one changed heart at a time.